Hello, this is Peter Leahy from Applied Learning, here to talk for about half an hour on credit spreads. The purpose of this presentation is to help participants understand the main methods used for expressing credit spread in the environment of fixed income securities. You will gain familiarity with the calculations. Attached with this video, you will find an Excel workbook with 7 spreadsheets relating to different calculations on credit spreads. I would encourage you now to switch to that spreadsheet and we'll walk through some of the calculations together. So you can see here in the credit spread examples spreadsheet, you can see on the first of the tabs we have coupon and yield. The purpose here is I'm going to be showing, and this will help us particularly when we come to talk about Z spread. It's important also in the context of swaps and in government spreads anyway. I want to show how the coupon of a bond has an influence on its yield, and that being so, the coupon of a bond, the coupon of a benchmark, the coupon of a bond that's being compared to a benchmark has an influence on the yield. And a credit spread, in its simplest case, is the difference between the yield on a, for example, corporate bond and the yield on a government bond, a subtraction one from the other. And we need to recognize that if those numbers are distorted potentially by what happens to be the coupon rate, so the spread can be distorted. I've taken an imaginary zero coupon curve here for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and there are the rates shown. I've used those rates to calculate factors shown here and present values. And I've then taken a 4-year bond, as I said. I've calculated what would be the fair value of this bond if we believe this zero coupon curve to be correct. I've then, in a second part of this calculation, I've said, well, if we have calculated what we believe to be a fair price for a bond, we can then iterate to find the yield. And so using the solver, I have done exactly that. I'll show another example in just a moment. So the yield in this zero curve environment, the yield of a 15% coupon bond is this number here, which I'll call 6.35. And you can see I've stored that over here. If the bond had, for example, a 5% coupon, then it would have had a different value. And notice that a different yield would need to apply. We're not now getting the same value when we apply the yield, which in fact was calculated for a 15% coupon bond. We need to iterate again, and I'll do that. We'll use the solver in Excel, so Tools menu, Solver. And we are going to now get the ratio between the fair value we consider this bond to have, this 5% coupon 4-year bond, and the fair value that we're getting by an iterative process to find the yield. And so this ratio we're going to set to 1 by altering the yield input. And I've set it to do that. It takes a moment. And of course, what you now have for a 5% coupon bond, you can see the yield needs to be more like 6.44, and I've stored that over here. So you can see that for different levels of coupon then, a different yield is appropriate, even with the same borrower, so the same credit, same borrower, and the same zero coupon curve environment, a different yield applies to differently couponed bonds. That's hardly surprising because you can see an upward sloping zero curve, and of course the extent of coupon, a higher coupon, gives greater proportional influence to the 1, 2, and 3 year, in this case, zero coupon rates, and proportionately less to the 4-year. Of course, a zero coupon bond, there's only one zero rate that we care about, and that's the 4-year one. Therefore, it is not surprising that going through the same process as we just did with a zero coupon bond, we would find a yield of 6.5. I do this because when we come to talk about Z spread, which we will in a short while, we'll see that this is a problem. It's a problem about comparing corporate bond yields to, for example, government benchmarks. And the main purpose of Z spread is in fact to eliminate this problem. I've shown some benchmarks now on the next sheet. These are taking some UK gilt benchmarks. So just what happens to be on a particular date, and this was in February 2016, the benchmarks of UK gilts for various maturities. Notice, if you will, that the UK, unlike the United States and some other countries, we do not have in the UK an automatic new benchmark rollover as and when a predicted auction happens quarterly, or in some cases semi-annually. In the United States, we don't do that. In the UK, it's rather ad hoc. And you can see, for example, the 15-year and 20-year securities and the 30-year really are not likely to be very new. I say that because you can see the prices are some distance from par, and most likely then they were first auctioned some time ago with coupons that are now some distance from what you might consider fair market. So a 30-year security, you can see the yield of 230. If you were auctioning a new one, you might be auctioning a new one with a coupon more like 2.25 perhaps, and a yield of 230 would put it just below par, and that's the kind of thing that governments do with new auctions. So these benchmarks are a little distorted, and given what we've just seen, you can imagine that some of the yields are a little bit distorted as a consequence of especially high, or be prepared for other circumstances, especially low coupons, especially high in the current environment compared to what might be considered a currently fair coupon in the market. In preparation for other things, I've also taken a sheet, or created a sheet, that has a par swap, and this is a British pound par swap. The purpose of doing this here was really just to take a zero curve, some special dates, and you will see match a bond we're going to look at. So this is not a 5-year swap, it's not a 4-year swap, it's about from February 2016 to December 2020, it's about a 4.75 year swap. Here are the periods shown here in half-year units, because pound sterling uses semi-annual calculations, and a zero curve, once again semi-annual quotation, and indeed actual 365 is our day count. So semi-annual compounding and actual 365 day count. This is just in conformity with how things work in British pound and indeed some other currencies too. So the factors shown here in conformity with the zero curve. I've calculated the floating payments, and I've done this for very simply a face value of 1 for the swap, just to keep the numbers simple. And the fixed payments, well, we had to iterate a coupon that would give us a fair set of fixed payments, such that when we receive fixed and pay floating in this case, and discount the net cash flows using the discount factors we've already calculated, we get to a zero value for the swap. So we've found, and this will be useful to us for our credit spreads in a short while, we've found that the par swap rate for this maturity is, as you can see, just a little below 1%, 0.974. Now I introduce a fixed income security recently issued at the time of recording this, and this is an IBRD, so World Bank British Pound Bond. And you can see this matures in December 2020, and you can see the payment dates are 15th of December, and that's why I used those dates for the par swap, although of course in the case of the swap we did in a couple of instances need to adjust them for modified following, as you can see that we have. So that is our World Bank bond. Oh, and by the way, as it was issued as well with a less than whole first coupon period, you can see you have a special first coupon. This is not an uncommon feature of bonds of all kinds. So for the next payment in December 2016, you're getting a little bit less than a whole normal annual coupon. And the total value of the bond shown here, the dirty price, which is what we're going to care about for most aspects of what we do, 101.87. I'm going to go straight to the Z spread for this bond now. We've already calculated the yield. Then you can see we found the yield. I took the clean price of the bond off Bloomberg, in fact, and I iterated to find the yield that tallied with that clean price. And you can see I did that using, once again, the solver. So I set B12, the clean price, to a value of 101.721 by changing, by iteration, by trial and error, if you will, trial and error, Newton-Raphson convergence of this cell B7, which is the yield. And I could press solve. When I do that, it goes away and thinks about it for a moment, and you can see we already had the solution anyway, so no matter. But that is how you would go about it for a different price. You put in a different price in that dialog box we were just looking at, and the solver will once again iterate to find the yield that satisfies that price. So let's now take the Z spread of this bond. I'm going to do the Z spread for precisely the same dirty price. So we're saying we know the dirty price of this bond. The Z spread will normally be a spread over a LIBOR curve, so pound sterling LIBOR. So in fact, I have the luxury here of having already taken the zero coupon curve for the relevant periods. And in fact, I can take simply that same curve again. You can see there it is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the zero curve, rather as I did in the first sheet, to discount the cash flows of this bond. However, I am also going to allow myself the possibility, let's put that Z spread back to zero for a moment. I'm going to allow myself the possibility of bumping the zero curve. That is to say, adding an increment to it. So perhaps I want to add, a basis point to it. Yeah. So 0.977 becomes 0.987 and so on. What I'm going to do, and I calculate the value of the bond just as I did on the first sheet. Notice the factors are simply the other way up. It's convenient sometimes to do them as present value factors, sometimes as future value factors, the one being very simply the reciprocal of the other. 1 over a present value factor gives you a future value factor, and vice versa. So I've said we know the dirty price of this bond. Our spreadsheet is calculating a value for the bond. It is, for the moment, not, those two numbers are not the same thing. I'll use the solver again, and what I'm going to do with the solver this time is I'm asking, so what fixed spread do I need to add to all of the pound sterling LIBOR, or swap if you will, zero curve, so as to satisfy the discounted value of this bond's cash flows being 101.871. And I find, in fact, that I need to add about 3 basis points to the zero curve. Notice, by the way, you'll see in a moment, 3 basis points is about the same as we would expect for perhaps an asset swap. It's rather less, in fact, than we would have as a spread over governments, and I'll explain that in a moment. So the World Bank bond has a yield of just over 1. The 5-year benchmark had a yield of about 0.76. So in just very simply eyeballing it, we're getting a credit spread over the government curve of about 25. Over the swap zero curve, we're getting a credit spread of more like 3 basis points. And this is no surprise because we are using as a comparator two different curves here, a government curve and a zero curve. And at the 4 or 5 year point in pound sterling at the time of recording, the swap curve is noticeably higher than the government curve. So a spread over swaps will be a lesser number than a spread over governments. The important point to note here is that this Z spread has eliminated the impact of coupon. And one of the points, for 2 reasons in a sense, because firstly, it's discounting using a zero curve, And secondly, it's using a swap zero curve, and the swaps themselves, a new swap is a par priced instrument. I've then taken the same bond, of course, and I'm going to set this spread back to 0 as well. I have done the following. I've done an asset swap. This is where we could say an investor buying the World Bank bond, but having a motivation to create or obtain a floating rate asset. So buys the bond and then enters into a swap to pay the fixed coupons to a bank and receive floating in their place. Most likely floating plus or minus a spread. The first thing to say here, this is not at par, of course. The bonds are not at par, although the asset swap package by convention is sold at par. So from the bank's point of view, and we're doing this swap from a bank's point of view, selling the package to an investor, you've got an outflow. I've put this in the fixed column, an immediate outflow on a 10 million face amount, which I've used, of the percentage by which the dirty price exceeds par, so 1.871273%. And I've shown that number here as a payment from the bank to the bond investor. The bank is also going to be receiving the fixed coupons from the bond investor, so those where the upfront is a negative number, the coupons are a positive number. The bank is also going to be paying floating payments, although I haven't shown them as negative, perhaps I should have. That comes out in the discounting, in the net cash flows that we discount. So what I've done is I've taken the floating payments, once again, although what's headed here as floating is in fact just the LIBOR component of floating. We have also an amount of spread, so spread over LIBOR, which would be attached to the floating side in what the bank pays to this credit investor. You can see we have then discounted the cash flows. I've taken the bank paying out receiving the fixed, and paying out the two elements of floating, the LIBOR plus the spread, and discounting that using, in this case, D3, the discounting factors. And then I've done the same for each of them. And down at the bottom, I'm showing the total present value, which with a spread of 0 is not a zero value swap. And we need to find how to get this to a zero value swap. And we'll use once again the solver to do that. I've set it up already, so we want to get the total value of the swap to 0 by changing B18, the cash spread, to apply in this asset swap. And you can see, once again, we get to about 2.99 basis points. That being a swap once again, a spread once again over the swap curve. And as you might expect, it is not hugely different to what we found for the Z spread, as both of them are spreads over the swap or a swap related curve. The Z spread being a discounting spread over the swap zero curve, the asset swap spread being a cash flow amount that equalizes the value of the two sides, given that the bond investor here is paying over a fixed amount that is not the standard swap rate. It's driven by what happens to be the coupon of the bond, and also driven by, as we have seen, an upfront amount reflecting the non-par component of price that the bond investor is buying. So in summary then, looking at these credit spreads, I've taken the yield to maturity of the bond, and by the way, when we compare that to government securities, we would need to do that on the same with the same compounding frequency. So the World Bank bond, as we saw, had annual cash flows. The yield would normally be expressed on an annual basis. And so I have converted that to a semi-annual equivalent. That's the first thing we've done here, using a pretty simple and standard calculation, which I don't propose to dwell on in this forum. It's discussed elsewhere in the bond yield module. I then looked at looking at various benchmarks. Now, this bond has a maturity so towards the end of 2020. We've got a 5-year bond, or a 5-year benchmark, so-called, which is not actually 5-year, but let's just, it's the market calls it its 5-year benchmark, September 2020. And the 6-year benchmark is September 2021. That is, this bond lies in maturity terms between these two. Now, if we, for example, pull this bond up on Bloomberg, it will default to using a spread compared to the bond that was used for new issue pricing, which is not currently actually a benchmark. And that would show 32 basis points. Now, that is not a benchmark, and therefore you could say it's a little misleading, and I'll show you how misleading in just a moment. We could also, for example, on Bloomberg and elsewhere, we could compare this to the 5-year, gives you a one spread, 5-year being a little bit shorter in maturity, and the shape of the yield curve is positively sloping, so you're taking a slightly lower point in terms of government yield, therefore no surprise you're getting a slightly bigger result in terms of spread. Or a 6-year benchmark, a little bit longer than the actual maturity of this bond, therefore giving you a rather less favorable read of credit spread. So right away I've got two different benchmarks to compare with, or I've got the original comparator gilt that was used at the time of new issuance. I've also taken an interpolation between benchmarks, something shown on Bloomberg and on other systems. And what I've done here is I've taken the maturity date of the IBRD bond, and you can see this on the right hand side of the sheet. I've taken the maturity date of the 6-year benchmark and of the 5-year benchmark, and I've calculated from those a linear daily or daily based interpolation of the benchmark yield, and I've shown it here. So the benchmark yield in linear, using a linear interpolation between the 5-year and 6-year, gives us about 0.78, and as a consequence then a rather different take on the credit spread, certainly different to what you see using the original benchmark, and in fact different to either of the current benchmarks that you could use. So about 21, 22 basis points. My purpose in illustrating this is really just to show that the choice of methodology then can rather distort the apparent take on the valueness of the bond in question. And there are some who might use that deliberately, but it's good to be aware of. I've also looked at a spread over mid-swaps. So we calculated a mid-swap based par swap rate earlier on the sheet called par swap, you'll remember, and that was 0.974. And I've taken that here to, once again, compare to the bond price, the bond yield, forgive me. So 3 different takes now on the pricing of this bond vis-a-vis the swap curve. One, simply a yield versus swap rate, comparing the yield on the bond to the par swap rate for the same period to maturity. And you can see not hugely different numbers. The Z spread that we've discussed, and the asset swap that we have also discussed. In further modules, we look at OAS, option adjusted spread. However, not in this one for 2 reasons. One, because the option adjusted spread is a rather more sophisticated calculation, which requires as much time as this module has taken in its entirety. But also because this bond does not have embedded optionality, and therefore the OAS, or option adjusted spread, becomes irrelevant in this case. I thank you very much for your participation and hope that this has been useful and interesting to you. I do invite you to look at www.sovereignleadership.com, where you will find other similar instruction modules. Thank you.